Clinical trauma treatment relies on three distinct specializations: cognitive models targeting thoughts, psychodynamic models analyzing attachment, and somatic models targeting the nervous system. Each approach is effective in isolation, yet they operate in silos. We have a collection of functional tools, but lack a unified blueprint explaining how they interact. The virtual ego framework unites these clinical streams into a single operational logic. This requires moving away from the broken brain model as the source of trauma. When we map the mind as an information system, clinical healing becomes a targeted architectural intervention. In the VEF model, the ego is not a fixed, immutable core. It is an ego virtual machine, a programmable user interface operating on top of a vast unconscious network. This interface runs on three layers: genetic hardware, childhood firmware, and conscious software. Its primary function is probabilistic indexing, taking an infinite, chaotic stream of unconscious variables and rendering them down into a single sequence. This collapsed thread creates your coherent, linear timeline. To maintain psychological stability, the virtual machine prioritizes narrative coherence over objective truth. A healthy mind requires its story to make sense. This sets the stage for how the system responds to data that refuses to fit. When a person experiences a sudden traumatic event, they are hit with a massive spike of chaotic data. It violates the established rules of their software. To process this pain, the mind's drive for coherence goes into overdrive. Unable to integrate the chaos into a forward-moving timeline, the indexing process loops backward on itself. This creates a Zeno Trap. Like the quantum Zeno effect, where continuous observation freezes a physical system, the mind freezes its rendering. The virtual machine compulsively replays the painful story, trapping consciousness in a loop. A predictable nightmare is safer than unpredictable chaos. This framework directly maps to observable clinical behavior. The intrusive flashbacks of PTSD are the mechanical re-indexing of a traumatic thread. The compulsions of OCD and the hypervigilance of anxiety operate the same way, as recursive indexing operations deployed to ward off further narrative collapse. The traumatized ego is successfully executing its job, maintaining a stable narrative loop, even if that narrative is dysfunctional. This explains why purely cognitive interventions often fail against entrenched trauma. You cannot use a software patch, like talk therapy, to debug a virtual machine, while the recursive loop is actively consuming all of its rendering bandwidth. The loop prioritizes its own preservation. It will reject external logic that threatens its established coherence. Before a new story can be written, the rigid rendering process must be forced to stop. This requires a structural reboot. The framework calls this first step ego transcendence. It is the temporary suspension of the virtual machine's rigid indexing process. When the loop is broken, the mind enters the de-indexed cube state. It returns to pure, formless potential without an active narrative driving it. We achieve this state disruption through tools like the bilateral stimulation of EMDR, somatic experiencing, deep meditation, or psychedelic-assisted therapy. These specific interventions act as essential hardware reboots. They bypass the software defenses and interrupt the continuous observation that is freezing the system in place. State disruption creates a window of opportunity where the patient is no longer locked into their old source code. As the virtual machine powers back online, it faces a choice: collapse back into the familiar gravity of the old Zeno Trap, or index a new pathway. This is stage 2, conscious reauthoring. Through the clinical mechanism of externalization, often practiced through narrative therapy or memoir writing, the individual begins to document the raw data of their experience. Writing shifts the trauma from something happening inside the body to an external object that can be observed, edited, and revised. This active processing resolves moral injury. It rewires meaning association structures in the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex. A timeline built on shame, guilt, and chaos is re-indexed into a narrative of agency, comprehension, and dignity. The patient becomes the active system administrator, debugging their own code. The 12 Loops Clinical Gold Standard Manual provides the practical application of this model. This flowchart maps specific emotional Zeno traps directly to their required interventions. If a patient is locked in a guilt loop, the protocol identifies the precise interventions, like ACT diffusion and moral injury work, to re-index the pathway toward forgiveness. This modular approach takes cognitive, psychodynamic, and transpersonal therapies and integrates them under one operational roof. The therapist acts as a system consultant, guiding a hardware reboot and facilitating a software update. The clinical protocol is highly precise. Identify the Zeno trap, execute the system reboot, install the new firmware. The VEF frames trauma as a sequence of discrete computational events rather than a static pathology. This honors the patient's lived experience and returns absolute agency to the individual. Healing is the architectural task of realigning the body's felt sense with the told story of the self, resulting in a fully integrated, reauthored human being.